It was not in Germany, it was not in Russia. The worst hell of the 20th century where science and brutality met was in Manchuria, China, a place called Pingfang. This was the headquarters of Unit 731, a harmless name that concealed an industrial machine for producing death. Its leader was Shiro Ishii, a doctor, a brilliant bacteriologist, and a state-sponsored mass murderer. Ishii believed that future wars would be decided by pathogens, and he needed to experiment. He needed living hosts. The Empire of Japan had occupied Manchuria. They called it Manchukuo, a puppet state. The Kwantung army ruled with an iron fist. Ishii arrived here with a virtually unlimited budget. He built a massive complex. From the air, it looked like a lumber mill or an industrial plant. It was the perfect cover. Inside were the world's most advanced laboratories, crematoria, and prisons. They called the prisoners Maruta, meaning logs, a dehumanizing term, turning people into raw materials. They were Chinese, captured civilians, resistance fighters. They were Russians, white guards who had fled the Soviet Union. They were Koreans, and possibly even a few captured Allied soldiers. They were never called by name. They were only called by number. When one Maruta died, a new Maruta would replace them. The supply was endless. The experiments began. Ishii's goal was not to cure disease. His goal was to weaponize it. He wanted to know how much the human body could endure before it broke. They studied bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid. They forced prisoners to become infected, orally. They injected viruses directly into their veins. They forced prisoners to eat contaminated food. They transmitted infections sexually. They forced male and female prisoners, both infected with syphilis, to have intercourse, to study the effects on a fetus. Then, they vivisected the mother, without anesthesia. Vivisection was standard procedure at Unit 731. Ishii believed anesthesia would spoil the results. He wanted to see the organs functioning in their most pristine state, even as they were being ravaged by disease. They removed body parts, stomachs, livers, lungs. They wanted to see what would happen without them. They amputated limbs and tried to reattach them to the opposite side of the body. They transfused animal blood into humans. They wanted to see the limits of life. The Manchurian winter was incredibly harsh. Temperatures could drop below -30 degrees Celsius. This was a perfect opportunity to study frostbite. They took prisoners outside, forced them to dip their bare hands into barrels of cold water, then let the freezing air do its work. The researchers would go out to check. They used a small stick to tap on the arms. If it made a solid sound like a piece of wood, it was completely frozen. Then, they tested thawing methods. Some were doused with hot water. The skin and flesh immediately sloughed off the bone. Others were left alone to see how long it took for gangrene to set in. They tested the limits of dehydration. Prisoners were locked in hot rooms, without water, until they died. They were weighed constantly. They wanted to know exactly what percentage of the human body was water. Unit 731 was not just a laboratory, it was a weapons factory. They bred massive quantities of fleas, millions of them, fed them on the blood of plague-infected rats. Then, they packed these fleas into special ceramic bombs. These bombs were not designed to create a large explosion. They were designed to shatter on impact, releasing a cloud of infected fleas. They had to test their effectiveness. They took prisoners to an open field, tied them to stakes. A plane flew over, dropped the ceramic bombs. The scientists, in full hazmat suits, watched from a distance. They timed it. How long it took for the Maruta to get sick, how the symptoms progressed, and how long it took for them to die. They also tested other methods of destruction. They were particularly focused on the limits of the human body. They tested pressure chambers. Prisoners were sealed inside. The pressure was slowly increased. They wanted to know the exact point at which the chest would implode. The scientists recorded every detail. Then they tested the reverse. The pressure was suddenly dropped, simulating a pilot in freefall from tens of thousands of feet. The person died instantly from decompression sickness. Blood bubbled in their veins. Their eyes were pushed from their sockets. This was an industrial-scale operation. Thousands of Japanese scientists, technicians, and soldiers worked at Pingfang. They were trained to see the prisoners as non-human. It was the only way they could do their job every day. They held presentations. Ishii would stand before his staff, showing horrific images of the experiments, treating them as scientific achievements. The estimated death toll at the Pingfang complex alone reached the thousands, possibly more than 10,000. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Ishii's work did not stop in the lab. He took biological warfare to the real world. The Japanese army used Unit 731's weapons against Chinese civilians. They dropped plague-infected fleas on cities like Ningbo and Changde. They poisoned wells with cholera and typhoid pathogens. These attacks caused horrific epidemics. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians died. They died in agony, unaware they were victims of a deliberate attack. Local doctors were helpless. They had never seen outbreaks so violent and strange. Ishii had proven his point. Biological weapons were effective. August 1945. Everything changed. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The Red Army swept through Manchuria. Shiro Ishii's brutal party was coming to an end. The High Command in Tokyo gave the order: destroy all evidence. Wipe Unit 731 off the map. A frantic race began. Ishii ordered the execution of all remaining Maruta. Hundreds of them. They were shot, injected with poison, thrown into the crematoria. Not a single witness was allowed to live. The staff began destroying the buildings. They dynamited the labs. They threw research documents into the fire. They released the remaining infected animals into the surrounding environment, sowing one final ecological disaster. Shiro Ishii gathered his staff. He ordered them to disperse, to return to Japan at all costs, and to take this secret to their graves. But Ishii had no intention of dying. He knew he possessed something more valuable than gold: knowledge. Shiro Ishii faked his own funeral. Upon returning to Japan, he knew he was one of the most wanted war criminals. He disappeared into the chaotic crowd of a defeated nation. He hid in the countryside. He waited. Meanwhile, the Soviets had captured several low-level personnel from Unit 731. They held a trial in Khabarovsk. Horrifying testimonies of plague bombs, plague experiments, and Maruta began to emerge. But the world largely ignored them. They were dismissed as communist propaganda. The Americans, now occupying Japan under General Douglas MacArthur, knew better. They knew the Soviet accusations were not just propaganda. They began their own hunt, but they weren't looking for Ishii to bring him to justice. They were looking for him for the knowledge he carried. American intelligence knew Ishii was the mastermind. They knew he possessed what no other nation had: human experimental data. The United States was entering a Cold War with the Soviet Union. They could not let this data fall into enemy hands. They found Ishii in 1946. Instead of handcuffing him and taking him to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, where his German counterparts in Nuremberg were facing the gallows, the Americans brought Ishii to Camp Zama. They treated him with the respect due a scientist. The negotiations began. The Americans sent their top experts: Colonel Murray Sanders, Dr. Edwin Hill. These were the top minds of the U.S. biological weapons program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. At first, Ishii and his doctors played innocent. They claimed everything had been destroyed. They said they knew nothing about human experiments. But the Americans didn't believe them. They knew Ishii was bargaining. Shiro Ishii knew his value. He was holding hostage the hundreds of thousands of dead Chinese civilians. He named his price. He wanted immunity. Full immunity for himself. Immunity for every doctor, every researcher, every technician who had ever worked at Unit 731. In exchange, he would hand over everything. He wasn't lying about the scale. He had kept so much. Gruesomely detailed autopsy reports, thousands of preserved pathological samples, microscope slides showing the devastation of anthrax on human lungs, films documenting the process of gangrene from frostbite, detailed charts on the dosage of cholera bacteria needed to kill a person, data on how syphilis destroyed the brains of fetuses. It was a grotesque scientific treasure trove, purchased with the blood of over 10,000 Maruta. To the American scientists at Fort Detrick, this was a gold mine. They were shocked by the brutality. but they were also tempted by the data. Edwin Hill later wrote in a report. He said this data was invaluable. It was something that could not be obtained in the United States because of scruples about human experimentation. His report concluded that the information obtained from Ishii had allowed the American biological program to save many years of research and millions of dollars. The deal was struck. In November 1947, General MacArthur secretly sent a telegram to Washington. He recommended granting immunity to Ishii and his entire organization. Washington agreed. The exchange took place. Shiro Ishii handed over tens of thousands of pages of documents. In return, his name and the names of his accomplices were erased from the list of war criminals. The cover-up began. MacArthur lied to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. He claimed there was no evidence of Japanese biological war crimes. He blocked all Soviet attempts to put Ishii on trial. When the Soviets demanded the extradition of the 731 doctors, the U.S. refused. They said the men could not be found. Meanwhile, these very men were being protected and debriefed by U.S. intelligence. This was not just a deal. It was complicity. The doctors of Unit 731, who had vivisected thousands of people, were set free. They were never held accountable. Shiro Ishii, the mastermind, lived out the rest of his life quietly in Japan. He died of throat cancer in 1959, a peaceful death. The other doctors fared the same. They were never tried. Instead, they became respectable figures, deans of medical schools and directors of large pharmaceutical corporations. They built their careers on a foundation of brutality. Meanwhile, in America, Ishii's knowledge was integrated into Fort Detrick. The data on plague bombs was used to develop American weapons. The data on anthrax was studied. The U.S. biological weapons program was significantly advanced, thanks to the forced sacrifice of the nameless victims in Pingfang. Justice was not served. It was traded. It was sold for the price of military advantage. China and the victims were forgotten. For decades, the story of Unit 731 was dismissed as a myth, an exaggeration. It wasn't until the 1980s, when independent researchers and Japanese veterans began to speak out, that the truth slowly emerged. But by then, most of the perpetrators were dead. The American files remained top secret. It took decades of legal battles for the first documents to be declassified. They confirmed the worst. The cover-up was real. What happened after the war was just as brutal as what happened during it. It was a betrayal of justice at the highest level. The cruelty of Unit 731 is not just Japanese or Chinese history. It is also American history, a dark history where the line between science and crime, between ally and enemy, was completely erased in the pursuit of power. The legacy of the Maruta is not just the unmarked graves in Manchuria. It is also the biological weapons lying dormant in the world's arsenals. At Pingfang, the ground is silent. The ruins of the massive complex, partially destroyed by the Soviets and later leveled by local Chinese, became a forgotten scar. For many years, it was just a textile factory, but beneath the concrete, the soil was still contaminated. When Shiro Ishii ordered the release of the test animals at the last minute, he unleashed a curse. Plague-ridden rats, anthrax-infected rabbits. They ran into the Manchurian countryside. Immediately after the war ended, strange epidemics began to break out in the surrounding villages. Tens of thousands of Chinese people died from bubonic plague and other diseases in the years after 1945. They were the final victims of Unit 731, dying in a war that had officially ended. Meanwhile, Japan was busy rebuilding. They had a new narrative. The story of a victim nation. The victim of 2 atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became global symbols of wartime destruction. This narrative was powerful. It shaped Japan's post-war identity. In that story, there was no room for Unit 731, no room for Nanking, no room for comfort women. The aggressors had become the victims. And the world, in the context of the Cold War, accepted that story. The silence was maintained by both sides of the Pacific. The Americans were silent because they had bought the crime. The Japanese were silent out of shame, denial, and a desire to move on. Ishii's doctors, now pillars of society, said nothing. The veterans were ordered to maintain absolute silence, lest they be ostracized by society or worse. The Japanese government dismissed the accusations as communist propaganda, just as the Americans had. They denied everything. They said there was no proof. That Unit 731 was just a water purification unit. Anyone who tried to dig into the past was branded a troublemaker, an unpatriotic person. This silence lasted for decades. It became part of the tacit agreement. It wasn't until the early 1980s that a crack appeared. A Japanese journalist named Seiichi Morimura. He began to investigate. He found former members of Unit 731, old soldiers who were now ready to speak the truth before they died. The result was a book, The Devil's Gluttony, or Akuma no Hoshoku. The book was a bombshell. It detailed the Maruda experiments, the biological warfare operations. For the first time, the Japanese public was forced to confront a history they were never taught in school. The book became a bestseller. It caused a political firestorm. The Japanese right wing accused Morimura of being a traitor. Mainstream academics tried to refute him. But the crack had opened. Other testimonies began to emerge. Buried documents began to be found. Inspired by the newly exposed truth, Chinese victims began to speak out. In 1997, a group of 180 Chinese individuals filed a lawsuit against the Japanese government. They were not politicians. They were old farmers. People whose families had died from the plague spread by Unit 731. People who bore the scars of chemical weapons attacks. They demanded an apology. And they demanded compensation. The victims sued, but the Japanese government fought them with every legal maneuver. Years later, the court issued a tantalizing ruling. They acknowledged the crimes were real, but immediately dismissed the claim for compensation. Justice was once again denied. Despite this, the wall of silence had completely crumbled. In 2018, the National Archives of Japan released the identities of 3,607 members of Unit 731, an official, undeniable acknowledgement. Today, the Pingfang site is no longer a textile factory. It is a museum. It is not just a building. It is a permanent reminder. A complex dedicated to the crimes that happened, with a wall bearing the names of victims. Millions of Chinese visitors come here every year. It has become a crucial part of their historical education, a permanent reminder of the century of humiliation. The legacy of Unit 731 remains an open wound in Sino-Japanese relations. It is a symbol of a clear lack of remorse. Unlike in Germany, where Holocaust denial is a crime, in Japan, historical revisionism still exists and is tolerated. High-level politicians still visit the Yasukuni Shrine, which enshrines war criminals. Textbooks still downplay the severity of wartime actions, calling invasions incidents. For China and Korea, this ambiguity is a constant insult. For Japan, it is an unexorcised ghost, a collective self-delusion that prevents the nation's true maturation. The truth has been exposed, but reconciliation has never truly begun. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy this type of content, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next video.